Hello and welcome to The Last Word. Is today's Supreme Court judgment both relief for the government as well as broad vindication of Kapil Sibal's 2G defence? Those are the big questions tonight. My guests are former CAG and former Coal and Petroleum Secretary V.N. Kaul, the well-known Supreme Court lawyer Raju Ramachandran, the opinion editor of the Financial Express Sunil Jain, and Planning Commission member Arun Maira. Mr. Kaul, the Supreme Court has ruled that auction of natural resources is limited to spectrum. Auction is not the only route for alienating things like coal, oil, gas, iron ore, etc. Now, is this a relief for a government which after the February judgment of this year was worried that even land for schools and hospitals would have to be auctioned with damaging consequences?
I think it's a relief for government and for everyone else, in fact, because the judgment, I think the clarity and the balance of the judgment vindicate all kinds of confusions that were going on before. And I think this reference to 2G brings further clarity. In fact, you know where 2G decision limits itself. So I think this is a very good judgment, and the government can get back to the business of governing, and I hope it has a good policy now to implement.
Mr. Ramachandran, what I don't fully understand, and I'd like you to clarify for me, is on what basis has the Supreme Court decided to treat spectrum differently to all other natural resources? They've argued that spectrum has to be alienated by auction. Other natural resources can be alienated by means that are different if the government so chooses, which suggests that spectrum is somehow sui generis. But why?
Karan, this is because of the peculiarity of the judicial process, nothing else. There's no great conceptual distinction. The spectrum judgment of February became final because the government, which initially filed a review petition, chose to withdraw the review petition. So that's a final judgment. And in an advisory opinion under Article 143 of the Constitution, it is not open to anyone to question the correctness of a judgment. So that judgment has to stand where it is. The reference was confined, and the government had made it clear that it was not questioning the 2G judgment. The reference was therefore confined to other natural resources.
I follow what you're saying, and in a sense, to use layman's language, you're suggesting that there were technical reasons why spectrum has to be treated differently, even if there is no good logical reason for doing so. But let me then point out the peculiar contradiction which I think this opinion has lapsed into. It says spectrum has to be alienated by auction, thus equating auction with the public good. Elsewhere, it says that in fact the public good is above maximization of revenue, thus separating between the two. Now those two positions are presumably inconsistent, if not also contradictory.
I agree with you that they are inconsistent and contradictory, but as I said, that is the result of this peculiar judicial process. It was open to the government to have pursued its review petition. Perhaps even now, in the light of the tests laid down by the Supreme Court in this opinion, the government might consider reviving its review petition or filing a fresh review petition, saying that in the light of the law laid down in this opinion, the previous ruling on spectrum can't stand. It is possible to do that.
Which is very interesting. I'm just going to point this out and then move on, that in trying to protect the February judgment, actually the Supreme Court may have created grounds for a fresh questioning of the February judgment.
Absolutely.
Mr. Maira, there is one area where, of course, this opinion today is not a relief to the government. The judgment clearly, or the opinion clearly says that failure to auction 2G was a mistake. That is unavoidable until the Supreme Court changes its position on that point. So there's no relief on that limited issue. Would you accept that?
Well, from what I've just heard, the opinion of Mr. Ramachandran on the judgment, it does seem to be that at the moment there's no relief on that issue unless the government were to take it up again.
So to that limited extent, is this also an indictment of the decision the government took?
Well, I think I haven't read the full judgment, but what I've seen, the summary that has been reported, the Supreme Court, Honorable Supreme Court did say that decisions about the use of such resources, natural resources, should be taken in in the public interest, number one. Number two is that the process should be transparent and not provide undue benefit to some parties. So it is in that regard that I think that previous decisions of the government in how they gave out the spectrum might still be questioned.
Okay. Sri Jain, is there a question mark hanging over 2G allocations prior to 2008? If the Supreme Court opinion says that it was wrong in 2008 not to auction, then can it be right not to have auctioned in 2007, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1? Is there a question mark hanging over those earlier ones? Because when Kapil Sibal was asked today, he actually deliberately avoided giving a straight answer, and the Supreme Court opinion says nothing about the past.
I don't think there's any question at all, because the Supreme Court has very clearly said that we are not getting into the questions. You know, the presidential reference, we're looking at the licenses issued before 2008. The Supreme Court has very clearly said we're not getting into these at all. So therefore these are not under review at all.
But can they be raised in a separate petition to the Supreme Court today?
If you're asking me, I don't think they can, because the Supreme Court is very clear in the judgment. Whether it's spectrum or whether it's coal, they're saying that if you cannot show proof that the person who got the allocation without an auction, if you cannot show proof that this benefit was passed on to the average consumer, this is going to be illegal. It says very clearly. So I don't think there's any case.
But that's a different issue. Can someone now in a petition to the Supreme Court say that if not going down the auction route post 2008 was wrong, doesn't that open up the question, was it right to have done the opposite earlier? Can that be raised, or is it time barred?
It's too late in the day.
It's time barred.
Too late. It's time barred. It's barred by, what lawyers call latches.
Let's move on. Let's not get lost on this, because this is a bit of an arcane issue which I simply raised because it is something that people have questioned today. I want to come to the bigger, wider point that the Supreme Court makes, Mr. Kaul. They say that the public good is above maximization. Revenue maximization, they say, is not always the best way even of achieving the public good. Wider distribution is equally a factor to be borne in mind. How significant is that point?
I think it's very significant, but it's also commonsensical. There is an assumption ever in all kind of subsidies given by government that revenue maximization is not the ultimate end of public expenditure. There is an element of public good. And so the obvious has been stated, and stated by the Supreme Court. So I think it will bring sanity to decision making and to public discourse more than decision making.
Mr. Mara, one of the points the Supreme Court in its opinion today made is to say that the executive has supremacy in deciding policy, although of course, as they point out, it can then be challenged on grounds of fairness or criminality. But that is not in fact the stand that was taken in February by the Supreme Court, when the Supreme Court ruled that certain types of natural resources have to be sold by auction. There is no discretion in terms of policy making on the part of the executive. So once again, has today's opinion obliquely criticized the February judgment of the same court?
Well, I would say that, let's not go to the past. The same court, applying its mind when a reference was made to it, probably, took a larger picture, and now it's saying this is how it should be done in their view in the future, saying that the executive should apply its mind to the larger public good, and you don't have to auction the resource every time, which, as Mr. Kaul said, is commonsensical perhaps, but it's so nice that they're saying whatever we may have said in the past and how you may have interpreted it regarding this larger matter which you've referred to me, this is my view, the Honorable Supreme Court is saying. And I think that's absolutely right. But it's leading to a very important point. It's about process. When you say public good,
yeah, but I'm going to stop you.
How are we sure? What is the public good?
I'm going to stop you there, because although process is an important point, I want to stick narrowly to the question I asked you, which you very delicately and diplomatically sidestepped. Let me rephrase the question and put it to you, Mr. Ramachandran, in slightly different terms. Many people believe that there is here at least a partial vindication of the position that Kapil Sibal took. Not, interestingly, with specific reference to 2G, which is what he was talking about when he made the point. But his wider point was that the government has a right to decide policy and to determine how the public good is maintained, and it doesn't have to be necessarily done through maximization of revenue. The public good can be achieved in many other ways, and sometimes maximization of revenue may not achieve the public good. That wider point, the Supreme Court, in its opinion today, has completely accepted.
Why partial vindication? I think it's a complete vindication of that viewpoint. And let me also tell you, Karan, that the same bench which gave the judgment in the 2G case just 1 year earlier had said in the context of land allotment, when they were striking down allotment to a particular trust in Madhya Pradesh, the court said this, however, does not mean that the state can never allot land to the institutions, organizations engaged in educational, cultural, social or philanthropic activities or are rendering service to the society except by way of auction. Nevertheless, it is necessary to observe that once a piece of land is earmarked or identified for allotment to institutions engaged in any such activity...
Can I stop you? The point you're making is that the same two judges who in February insisted that everything had to be by way of auction had a year earlier said that in fact auction is not necessary, you can do it other ways too. So the same two judges have contradicted themselves within a year.
I wouldn't call it a contradiction. I think this is the basic approach. I think the judgment which was later delivered was in the context of the facts of 2G, and that loomed very large in their minds.
Okay, the facts of 2G loomed so large in their minds that, to put it kindly, they forgot what they had said a year earlier and came up with an extreme answer. You believe the opposite. Unlike Mr. Ramachandran, who says this is a complete vindication of the Kapil Sibal argument, you believe the opposite. Why do you believe the opposite?
Well, one, everybody thinks that auction is only about maximization of government revenue. That's not true. We had auctions in 1994 in telecom, where the bid criteria was the price at which you would actually give the service to people. So you can auction water, where your bid criteria could be who will supply it at the cheapest rate. It's an auction and it's benefiting people. It's not about revenue maximization. That's point number one. I think point number two is
except that the whole CAG argument then on the basis of auction falls. Your explanation of auction is very different to the CAG explanation.
Second point is that Kapil Sibal can never show in either the 2G case or in the coal case that the people who got the benefit, who got the licenses or the coal mines, actually passed on that benefit to consumers, which is what the Supreme Court lays down now as a touchstone for figuring out whether...
You're slightly wrong. You're over-interpreting what the Supreme Court lays down now. The Supreme Court says quite clearly that provided it meets the larger good, it is acceptable even for captive mining to go down the non-auction route. No, I don't have time for you to read it, but that is clearly what it said because you pointed it out to me earlier.
It says where there's profit maximization, you have to auction.
Provided the alternative meets the greater public good. That alternative, in fact, is the let-out clause.
No. Anyway.
Let's take a break at that point. We'll have to leave it to the audience to sort out whether you're right or me.
Absolutely.
I want to come back and ask, what are the implications of today's opinion on Colgate and on the CAG? Has the CAG's position been vindicated, or has it been embarrassingly undermined? That's in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back to The Last Word. We're discussing the Supreme Court's momentous opinion delivered earlier today, which, forgive me foolishly, I've been calling a judgment earlier. Technically, it is an opinion, not a judgment. Mr. Ramachandran, let's come to the implications of today's opinion for the CAG. Both in the 2G case and the Colgate case, the CAG has argued that if the government had auctioned, it would have earned this much more. Therefore, that amount is the presumptive loss. Now, the Supreme Court has today said quite clearly that there was no compulsion on the government to auction. It had a right to choose another method of alienation, and therefore the implication is there is no presumptive loss. Is that a knock on the head for the CAG?
Why should we call it a knock on the head? It definitely shows that the CAG's understanding of the Constitution and its mandate is wrong. The CAG is a constitutional body, but the CAG is not the arbiter of the Constitution. And the Supreme Court has gently reminded the CAG that its understanding is wrong.
I'm going to come to a former CAG who's sitting beside you, who I know in this instance is probably keen to defend his successor. But before I go to Mr. Court, let me put something else to you. Both in the 2G case and the Colgate case, the CAG was positing an alternate way of alienating a natural resource and was clearly suggesting that the alternate was a better and preferential way, if not actually the correct way. The Supreme Court has once again pointed out the CAG had no right to posit an alternative, leave aside, suggest that the alternative was better.
The Supreme Court, I think, rightly and again very gently, has reminded the CAG that policy making is the domain of the executive, and it's not for any other organ, whether it's the CAG or the Supreme Court, to tell the executive what it should or should not do. A given action can be challenged before the court and the court will examine it. But the court can't dictate policy, nor can the CAG.
How would you defend the CAG? Because I know from our earlier conversations, you disagree with my question that this is a knock on the head or a rap across the knuckles or even a subtle admonition to the CAG. So how would you defend the CAG?
No, you're free to take your own conclusion. I wouldn't go out of my way to defend the CAG for institutional reasons because I was CAG before. But the fact remains that the basic question you are addressing is whether what he wrote and did was within his mandate. Now that is a very technical question. It's not a question of what the newspapers say he did. You have to look at the report, and very few people have read the report. The CAG has clarified before the PAC that he did not exceed his mandate. He has clarified it once before when the Prime Minister had raised this issue.
But hasn't the Supreme Court suggested that in fact in positing an alternate way of alienating a resource, the CAG is exceeding his mandate? That's the point the Supreme Court makes today.
Now the question of mandate, you see, the CAG was not examining the CAG's report. The Supreme Court was not examining the CAG's report. They haven't commented, to my mind, on the CAG.
That's correct.
No. But they have merely said that policy making is the domain of the government.
Quite right.
And the CAG has no business talking about policy. I agree with that.
Okay.
But then you have to define what is policy and what is not. The government has permitted, through the changing of the performance auditing principles, something called audit of effectiveness. Now, my point is that there is a grey area where the audit of effectiveness overlaps with the audit of policy. Government must clarify by a new law. That is what it has to do.
There's need for clarification. There is a grey area which allows the CAG to expand and extend itself if it wants.
Or limits the CAG, the Parliament must decide.
And in fact, I want to bring you in specifically by saying Salman Khurshid today is reported to have said that the Supreme Court's opinion strengthens the government's position vis-a-vis the CAG. Would you agree or disagree?
Actually, it doesn't at all, and I'll tell you why. One, when the CAG said that there was a loss in the 2G case, the CAG was going by the government's stated position that spectrum has to be auctioned. This is why auctions took place in 2001. This is a cabinet resolution of 2003. So all that the CAG was doing was really sticking to what the government had said.
Now, the government's stated position about auction applies to Colgate.
No,
the government didn't have a stated position on auctioning spectrum.
In 2001, there was a spectrum auction. In 2003, when Arun Shourie...
There was a cabinet decision to say that the price will be fixed by the joint opinion of the finance minister and the telecom minister.
It said
the 2003 October...
We can again leave it to the public, but the cabinet resolution very clearly said there will be auction. In the case of the Colgate or the coal thing, the Prime Minister himself said that we should auction it. So the
Prime Minister said we should auction it, but the process of deciding went on till 2012.
So the CAG went along with what government position was. Lastly, there is a performance audit which mandates for the CAG constitutionally to start looking at whether something was effective or not effective. It applies to expenditure, it applies to everything. So
let me bring in Mr. Maira. Mr. Maira, we have an interesting dispute over here in the studio. You've heard it all, but I quickly recapitulated for the audience. Mr. Ramachandran clearly believes that the CAG has been, how shall I put it, admonished or gently rapped across the knuckles. Mr. Kaul is not necessarily defending the CAG, but believes there is a grey area which needs to be clarified by Parliament. And Sunil Jain is much more forcefully arguing that, in fact, the CAG was perfectly within his rights to posit an alternate way of alienating resources and to conclude that by not doing so there is a presumptive loss. Where do you stand quickly on this multiplicity of opinions regarding the CAG?
Well, I say is that I would rather not go into who was right and who was wrong, but we seem to have come to an agreement, everybody, that the making of policy and in policy to ensure that the larger public good is served is the job of the executive. The Supreme Court is saying it, and I think the CAG has also said it every time he's been asked to clarify that. So we are all in agreement. So now the question comes is, whatever the Supreme Court had judged as well as the CAG had commented upon, were there other matters, actually the real matters that they were pointing to, which was about, if I can once again say, about the process by which certain parties were given rather than others, number one, and number two, in thinking through the whole scheme to ensure that there was public good and not just private gain. So that is the two comments in both matters, in Colgate as well as Spectrum, I think that we have to get to.
We can't get to it, unfortunately, but I leave you the last word where you point up what in a sense will be the issues this program wasn't able to expand and cover. But those are clearly two issues that deserve attention. Maybe one day we'll come back to them. My thanks to all four of my guests for joining me, and if you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye, good night.